Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new episode of Stories from Space podcast, where your host, Matthew Williams, examines the history of human spaceflight, the breakthroughs that revolutionized our understanding of the universe and our place in it, and the brave individuals who work tirelessly to advance the frontiers of our understanding. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
The authors acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on the traditional, unceded lands of the Lekwungen peoples. Hello, and welcome back to Stories from Space. I'm your host, Matt Williams, and today I want to discuss a long overdue topic, which is the James Webb Space Telescope and the controversy surrounding its name. Now, for most people, this controversy was first introduced to them in 2021 after an article was published in Scientific American that was authored by a team of astronomers and cosmologists led by Chanda Prescod Weinstein. She's an assistant professor of physics and core faculty member in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire, and is the author of The Distorted Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Spacetimes, and Dreams Deferred. However, for many others, the controversy didn't start there. As we'll get into in this episode, the choice to name the James Webb Telescope thusly had led to some opposition and pushback from many scientists as early as 2003 when the decision was made. So, first of all, some background on the Space Telescope itself. Originally, the James Webb Space Telescope was conceived of in the 1980s, but planning did not begin until the 1990s. With the deployment of Hubble, NASA and its scientific and commercial partners were thinking of a successor mission, one that would follow up on all of Hubble's observations using next-generation optics, spectrometers, and the like. At the time, it was known as the Next Generation Space Telescope, and it was officially proposed in 1996. Roughly 6 years later, the decision was made to rename the project the James Webb Space Telescope in honor of the late James E. Webb, who had died 10 years prior. He was NASA's second administrator and oversaw the Apollo program from 1961 to 1968. However, this decision met with a lot of opposition, mainly because it broke with convention. In the past, all scientific instruments that were deployed to space were named in honor of the scientific principle they were investigating, which often meant that they were named after the person who first proposed it. And this includes the Chandra Observatory, the Spitzer Space Telescope, the Compton Space Telescope, and of course, the venerable Hubble. Using Hubble as an example here, it was named for the Hubble constant, because this is exactly what the telescope would be investigating once it was deployed to space. By conducting deep field observations of the cosmos, astronomers using Hubble data hoped to constrain the Hubble metric, in other words, the rate at which the universe was expanding. And this in turn was named after Edwin Hubble, the famous astronomer, who determined, alongside Georges Lemaitre, that the cosmos was in a state of expansion. Furthermore, the naming convention usually involved consultations with the scientific community, with other NASA centers, and even with public input, oftentimes involving children sending in essays suggesting names for a mission and why they thought it would be appropriate. This decision, however, was made by NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe, an appointee of the George W. Bush administration, and had served as the 10th administrator of NASA from 2001 to 2004. In a statement issued at the time, he said, "It is fitting that Hubble's successor be named in honor of James Webb. Thanks to his efforts, we got our first glimpses at the dramatic landscape of outer space. He took our nation on its first voyages of exploration, turning our imagination into reality. Indeed, he laid the foundations at NASA for one of the most successful periods of astronomical discovery." As a result, we're rewriting the textbook today with the help of the Hubble Space Telescope, the Chandra X-ray Observatory, and the James Webb Telescope. In short, the decision to rename the Next Generation Space Telescope to the James Webb Space Telescope broke with an established convention which, even though it did not go against any official rules, and the fact that the then current administrator at NASA took it upon himself to decide the name of Hubble's successor, a rather important decision, and that he would choose to name it after a fellow administrator and career civil servant like himself, was seen as a case of executive overreach or the dismissal of the opinions of the scientific community. However, in 2015, the controversy reached a new level of intensity thanks to revelations about the role James Webb played in the historic period known as the Lavender Scare. Now, the public had already been given a preview of this thanks to David K. Johnson, a historian who released a book in 2004 called The Lavender Scare, which indicated through archival evidence that Webb, along with other State Department heads, were involved in the systematic purging of federal employees on the basis of them being gay. This took place in the 1940s and 50s, and it coincided with the rise of McCarthyism. And the name Lavender Scare comes from a quote by McCarthy himself, who viewed homosexuality as a gateway to communism, or that homosexuality and communism were indistinguishable. Both examples of what he viewed as subversive or deviant behavior. As David Johnson indicated in his book, McCarthy identified homosexuality as the, quote, psychological maladjustment that led people towards communism. The Red Scare now had a tinge of lavender, end quote. Furthermore, under the influence of Republican politician Joseph McCarthy, the proponents of this scare believed that because there was a social stigma attached to the sexuality of people in the LGBTQ plus community, that they were at risk of being blackmailed or of becoming Soviet assets based on the compromat. Essentially, people would be vulnerable because they didn't want this aspect of their lives revealed to the public, and therefore they'd be at risk of manipulation. However, this was a very, very cynical justification, seeing as how, as noted, McCarthyites viewed homosexuality and communism as virtually indistinguishable. This is similar to what the Nazis believed when it came to communism and Judaism, where they accused Jews of fostering communist movements in countries as a means of undermining national unity and spreading chaos. In short, irrational paranoia based on hatred and ignorance. This purging, in any case, it was between 1949 and 1952, when James Webb served as the Undersecretary of State in the Truman administration, when Executive Order 10450 and other provisions that banned subversives from office were implemented. And the debate surrounding this issue was all about whether or not Webb was a complicit individual in all this, or whether he was just going along with policy, aka just following orders. And a key point in the debate revolved around what Nicholas Edsel, a historian, had argued in his book about the Lavender Scare titled Towards Stonewall, Homosexuality and Society in the Modern Western World, which was published in 2003. And in terms of the debate surrounding James Webb, there is a passage which is quoted that says, in early 1950, when an Undersecretary of State testified to a Senate committee that most of the government employees dismissed for moral turpitude were in fact homosexual. And this has since been addressed and corrected, because apparently Edsel was mistaken in referencing the Undersecretary of State as the one testifying before Congress, and that the person in question was in fact John Purifoy, who was the Deputy Undersecretary of State for Administration. And the records show that Purifoy had testified before Congress several times on the issue of purging homosexuals and the risk of having them in government positions. However, what is more clear is the fact that Webb, as Undersecretary of State, was involved with what was called the Hoey Committee, which was chaired by Democratic Senator Clyde R. Hoey, From 1949 to 1952, which was specifically tasked with investigating the employment of homosexuals, and Webb's own involvement with this committee comes up at 2 points. The first was on June 22nd, 1950, when he met with President Truman to determine, and second on June 28th, 1950, when he met with Senator Hoey, as well as Charlie Murphy and Stephen Springard, who were the White House counsel and an administrative assistant to Truman. Now, in terms of what was discussed at these meetings, according to Brian C. Odom, who is the NASA chief historian who investigated the matter, the purpose of these meetings was to determine, in President Truman's words, quote, a proper basis for cooperation, end quote, with the Hoey Committee and also with the larger congressional investigation. In any case, all of this was the subject of an investigation that took place in November of 2022, conducted by Odom and his colleagues. And the report details how Odom and his team reviewed over 50,000 pages of documents from archival collections, including the archives at NASA HQ in Washington, D.C., the Marshall Space Flight Center, the National Archives and Records Administration, and the Truman Presidential Library. And the investigation focused on two very key points. One was the aforementioned meetings that Webb had with Truman and with Senator Hoey, and second, on the firing of one individual in particular, Clifford J. Norton, who was a NASA budget analyst who was fired and arrested in 1963. And it's worth noting that Norton would go on to sue the Civil Service Commission, which ruled in his favor and paved the way for this policy, Executive Order 10450, being overturned in 1975. And in the end, the authors stated that the report found Webb's primary involvement was to attempt to limit congressional access to the personal records of the Department of State. None of the evidence found links Webb to actions or follow-up in pursuit of firings after these discussions. They also indicated that they could not conclude, one way or another, whether or not Webb was even aware of Norton's firing at the time. And based on these findings, NASA chose not to rename Webb. Naturally, this decision resulted in some backlash, some pushback from the scientific community, in particular from people who felt that the investigation really hadn't done its job, that its scope had been deliberately limited to ensure that nothing would change. One critic in particular was Jason Wright, who is a professor of astronomy and astrophysics at Penn State and a member of the Sexual and Gender Minority Alliance, which is the committee that advises the American Astronomical Society on LGBTQ plus issues. And Wright's main criticism was at the nature of the investigation itself and how it interpreted Webb's involvement in the purging of homosexual employees, both as Undersecretary of State and as the Administrator of NASA. As Adam and his team stated in the executive summary of their report, the central purpose of this investigation was to locate any evidence that could indicate whether James Webb acted as a leader of or proponent for firing LGBTQ plus employees from the federal workforce. Wright countered this via Twitter, saying, as expected, it looks like NASA asked the historians to focus on a narrow question that's only part of the rationale for renaming JWST. Of course, being a leader or proponent for firing LGBTQ plus employees would be disqualifying. But the bar for putting a name on the most important telescope in a generation should be a bit higher than that, no? That said, the evidence we knew about is still there. Firing LGBTQ plus people at NASA was custom within the agency when Webb was administrator. He may not have been a leader or proponent of that policy, but neither did he resist or minimize it. He must have been aware of it. And as he'd write on his website, Astro Write, this decision was basically an insult to all of the LGBTQ people currently working at NASA. As he said, think for a moment about the LGBTQ NASA employees working on JWST today. They want to be proud of their work, proud of the telescope, proud as LGBTQ NASA employees, but just to use the name of the telescope is to name a man who undisputedly would have had them fired. This feels perverse to me. And he certainly has a point. On the one hand, the report's conclusions basically amounted to James Webb was responsible for implementing a policy, as with many other heads of state, but we can't prove that he liked what he was doing, which in the end seems like a massive irrelevance. And what's more, for all people working at NASA today who are busy developing and analyzing and processing all of the wonderful, groundbreaking data that Webb is providing, they're basically living with the knowledge that this man, if he were still around today, we wouldn't have jobs. We wouldn't be here. We would have been purged for being subversives. And indeed, many, many lives were ruined as a result of this policy back in the day. Much like accused communists who had been blackballed by the Red Scare and McCarthyism, the victims of the Lavender Scare were publicly outed, they're shamed, they're ridiculed, and they were not hired again. So professionally and personally, their lives were upended. However, the conclusions and the release of the report also had a bit of a twist. Aside from them concluding that they would not be changing the name of the James Webb Space Telescope, there was also indications that NASA was willing to re-examine its naming policies and make changes. And this was indicated by a statement that was released by the American Astronomical Society, and it was authored by the Board of Trustees, in which they stated that many AAS members are concerned about the response of NASA to the JWST name and process, and we wanted to provide a brief update. In response to our most recent letter, Administrator Nelson replied that NASA's acting chief historian, as well as a contract historian, were reviewing records and that NASA would share the findings publicly after completion, thus referring to the report. And they go on to state that Nelson also agreed that the mission naming policy for NASA must be re-examined, and that will also be shared. We await these results. And something did come of this. As of April 2023, NASA announced that it had new policy in place that would make it unlikely that future missions will be named after individuals. However, all of this did strike the scientific community, many members of it, as window dressing and appeasement. On the one hand, the conventions for naming the great observatories, which in the past had involved consultation, as previously noted, these were not followed when it came to assigning a name for the James Webb Space Telescope, so why would they need to be revisited and re-examined? As we covered earlier, the decision to name the telescope after James Webb had been Sean O'Keefe's. It was a unilateral decision that broke with convention. So, that being said, the decision to, on the one hand, uphold the naming of the James Webb Space Telescope, which of course broke with established policy, and then on the other hand, to say that the policies needed to be updated to prevent such things from happening again, seemed both intransigent and superfluous. And as Jason Wright would also indicate on his website, in the midst of all this controversy and the release of the report, the scientific community was already taking steps to address the issue of nomenclature and was basically taking matters into its own hands. As he wrote, "At this point, NASA's resistance has gone from stubbornness to recalcitrance. Already, NASA employees are refusing to use the name in prominent publications. The Royal Astronomical Society says that it expects authors of the monthly notices for the Royal Astronomical Society not to use the name. And other publications were also upfront about using the abbreviation but not spelling it out. And this was partly motivated by a spirit of accommodation for people who, for reasons of conscience, did not want to use the name, but also as, arguably, a little act of resistance. The scientific community is basically fighting back against a decision that they were left out of in the first place and have felt the same way ever since." Jason Wright, Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, and members of the American Astronomical Society and more expressed openly how disappointed they were not only with NASA's decisions, but in how they went about dealing with the opposition and the moral outrage on behalf of the LGBTQ plus community and the scientific community. Basically, NASA was giving them the bureaucratic runaround and dismissing what they had to say. What's more, this controversy really echoed another major controversy involving NASA and its personnel, its scientists, and that had to do with the case of Wernher von Braun. NASA's response to this controversy in particular, and the way they framed the issue, dredged up a lot of memories about the complicity of German rocket scientists, such as von Braun, during World War II, in which they were members of the Nazi Party and involved in a number of crimes against humanity. In particular, von Braun, who was not only a member of the Nazi Party and an SS officer, his weapons were used to kill civilians, but even more egregious than that was the fact that they were built using slave labor from a local concentration camp, and that more people actually died building and servicing these rockets than were killed by them. And all of these crimes, these were not publicly known at the time that of von Braun's greatest contributions to NASA. And while today NASA has all that information on their website addressing Braun's involvement with the Nazis and the war effort, this information was not widely known until after von Braun died. And of course, much like Webb, there are people who would argue that, oh, we don't know the full extent of his involvement, we don't know if he agreed, endorsed, or was truly responsible for implementing decisions and policies that led to people being killed, but it really comes down to the same kind of moral turpitude and ambiguity. It really is not a defense at all to say that even though they were responsible for murder and crimes against human beings, crimes against humanity, well, we can't say for sure that they shared the views that led to this. And of course, others would argue that had von Braun not been recruited under Operation Paperclip, along with other German rocket scientists, that NASA would not have achieved its ultimate victory in the space race against the Soviets. Because, of course, the Soviets were also recruiting former Nazi rocket scientists to assist in their programs. To which, of course, one can easily counter that, well, that's all fine and good. It was an act of necessity during the Cold War. However, the truth needs to come out. And we also need to acknowledge that it is not just to be naming any big, bold, and hopeful missions after individuals who had blood on their hands. Or at the very least, in Webb's case, had ruined lives. But all this is made even more difficult based on the fact that we don't know exactly what these people were thinking or where they stood, and we will never know. If there's no other records or indications or testimonials, then that will remain a gray area for all time. And furthermore, why do we even need to know? Fact remains that they committed the very acts that they are accused of, and whether or not their heart was in it is irrelevant. And it really doesn't matter in the case of the James Webb Space Telescope in the first place. We name missions after the fundamental concepts that they are investigating, and if that does involve the name of a prominent scientist from the past, then yes, that will be applied. And as always, the decision should be made through the consultation process, and it should be appropriate to the mission itself. And this is certainly the case with the next generation telescope that's going to be Webb's successor, and even more importantly, the successor to Hubble, which is the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. This telescope is set to deploy by 2027, though engineers and technicians at NASA are hoping to attempt a 2026 launch. And this observatory is named after Nancy Grace Roman, who was the first female executive at NASA and its first chief of astronomy. And this was during the 1960s and 70s, at a time when there were very, very few women at NASA. And one of her greatest contributions was in developing the concept for space telescopes. Because as she would argue, the only real way to get truly deep views of the cosmos, where they're free of atmospheric interference and light distortions and thermal problems, was to deploy a telescope to space, and therefore to have unfettered observations of the cosmos. And all these considerations went into the design and the deployment of Hubble. So Nancy Grace Roman is known as the Mother of Hubble. It's a popular nickname she picked up. And Nancy Grace Roman passed away in 2018, so she did have the honor of seeing her baby, Hubble Space Telescope, deployed to space and was able to be around and witness some of its greatest contributions to science. It's unfortunate that she won't be able to witness the launch of the telescope named in honor of her, but she certainly got to witness the very idea, the very concept that she gave rise to, realized for the very first time. Naming this next generation telescope after her, given that it's Hubble's natural successor, is extremely appropriate. In any case, it appears that the James Webb Space Telescope is going to continue to be named thusly. However, the issue is not going to go away, and it's not going to be resolved simply by changing the rules saying, well, don't name missions after individuals anymore. And nor should it go away, because it highlights the importance of executive decision-making and the responsibility that they have, especially when it comes to consulting with the wider scientific community, and of course the responsibility they have to the current and subsequent generations. We're leaving a legacy behind. We need to make sure that that legacy is representative of the values we want to carry forward. As always, the field of science and ethics, they're not separate. One cannot compartmentalize between science and what many would mistakenly label politics, but which is in fact simple questions of responsibility and what's morally right. And those considerations are not going away. Well, thank you for listening. Tune in again, where I'll be speaking with NASA scientist and technologist Les Johnson, where we discuss the latest volume, to which I'm a contributor, of scientific essays that explore interstellar exploration and the possibility of humans living on another world someday. Topics will, of course, include propulsion, a subject Johnson is intimately familiar with and also an expert of, and terraforming, of which I'm something of a hobbyist. And a sort of resident expert. Not my words. In the meantime, thank you for listening. I'm Matt Williams, and this has been Stories from Space.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stories from Space podcast with Matthew Williams. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.